They sent a fleet to erase us. One miner stayed. The first thing Dara Voss did every morning was check the seismic monitors. Not because the company required it. Harkin Extraction hadn't required anything from its Kareth 9 crews in 3 years, ever since the automated relay station took over reporting. She did it because the planet breathed, and she had learned to listen. Kareth 9 breathed wrong the morning the Veth arrived. She was sitting in the cramped monitoring booth of Shaft 7, coffee cooling beside her left hand, when the low-frequency readout spidered into a pattern she had never seen. Not geological, not equipment vibration, rhythmic, sequential, something with intention moving through the deep rock 4 kilometers below the colony's foundation grid. Dara set down her coffee and pulled up the secondary array. There were 43 separate signatures, moving north toward the colony. She keyed the general comm without thinking. This is Voss at 7. I need someone to look at my seismic feed right now. Not tomorrow, right now. Foreman Calix Wren answered with the kind of tired irritation that only comes from a man who has been wrong about everything being fine for too long. Voss, it's 0430. What is it this time? 43 subsurface contacts, organized movement, bearing northeast. Silence. Calix. I heard you, his voice had changed. I'm looking at it. She waited. The signatures kept moving. One of them diverged from the group, angling toward the eastern water reclamation tunnels. Wake the colony, she said. Dara. Wake them up, Calix. Wake all of them up right now. He didn't argue again. The Veth had been watching Kareth 9 for 11 years. This was something humanity would not learn until much later, pieced together from the crystalline memory lattices recovered from a destroyed Veth scouting pod. The Veth were patient in the way that things with a 600-year lifespan are patient, which is to say, absolutely. They had watched the human colony establish itself on the mineral-rich moon they called the Womb of Keth, watched the drilling rigs go in, watched the population grow from 47 to 612 over a decade, cataloged every power signature, every tunnel bore, every communication burst to the orbital relay. They had measured the colony with the precision of surgeons and the interest of anthropologists. Then they had decided the humans needed to leave. The Veth did not consider themselves violent, they considered themselves thorough. Their assault doctrine, decoded later by conquered xenolinguists, described the Kareth 9 operation in terms that translated roughly as a sterilization, the removal of an invasive organism from a habitat it was destroying. The mineral seams the colony had been boring into for a decade were sacred geological formations to the Veth, slow-growth crystal matrices that took 800 years to form and stored, in their molecular structure, something the Veth regarded as ancestral memory. Every blast bore Harkin extraction ran was, to the Veth, the equivalent of burning a library. They had sent a fleet of 9 ships. They expected it to take 4 hours. Dara was not a soldier. She had never held a weapon in her life until the morning of the attack, when Calix pressed a Harkin standard arc welder into her hands and told her it would burn through anything at close range, including Veth carapace. How do you know that? She asked. I don't, he said, but I know it burns at 3,200 degrees and I know those things bleed so. The colony had 308 adults capable of fighting, if you defined fighting loosely enough to include people armed with mining equipment. They had a security detail of 11, Harkin's idea of armed protection for a moon they had classified as low risk, with actual weapons, actual training, and the kind of quiet competence that Dara would learn to recognize in people who had seen bad things before. The security chief's name was Morrow. She was 46, short, with gray in her hair she had never bothered removing and the permanent squint of someone who spent most of her time outdoors in bright light. She did not panic when Dara showed her the seismic feeds. She looked at them for a long time, moved her jaw slightly like she was calculating and said, They're coming up through the service tunnels. All of them. All of them. Every main access route. It's a net. They've mapped us. Thoroughly. Morrow pulled up the colony schematic and started marking with a stylus. These 3 corridors converge at the central hub. If we pull everyone back to the hub before they break surface, we trade ground for consolidation. We give up the outer shafts, the processing units, all the equipment, but we keep the people in one place. And then what? Morrow looked at her with clear eyes. Then we find out how long we can hold. There was a sound from somewhere below them. A sound that made Dara's spine go to cold water. A low, harmonic thrumming, like the colony's own infrastructure had begun to hum at a frequency it wasn't designed for. Like something vast was vibrating the walls from the inside. Move, Morrow said. Now. The first wave hit the eastern processing wing at 0517. The Veth were not what any of them had imagined. Dara had grown up on the same cultural diet as everyone else her age. Veth in media were tall and blue and vaguely philosophical, the kind of aliens that gave speeches and signed treaties. These were not those aliens. These were 2.5 meters of dense, layered carapace, moving on 4 limbs with the low fluid efficiency of things that had evolved in tunnels, in the dark, for a very long time. Their heads were broad and flat, sensory organs clustered at the front in a complex arrangement that processed electromagnetic fields rather than visible light. They communicated through subsonic resonance. You felt it in your chest before you heard anything, a pressure that made it difficult to think clearly. They did not carry weapons in the way humans understood weapons. Their carapace could generate a focused electromagnetic pulse from organs in their forelegs, capable of frying unshielded electronics at 8 meters. They used this the way humans used firearms, as a first contact tool, to strip the colony of its technical advantages before moving in. Morrow had anticipated this. The colony comm system was dead within 90 seconds of first contact. Every hardened relay blasted. The automatic sentry units went dark. The overhead lighting in 3 sectors crashed. The atmospheric processors in the outer shafts shut down. What Morrow had done, quietly and without telling anyone in the 4 hours between Dara's first alert and first contact, was rig a hardline. Old copper wire, actual wire, pulled from the colony's maintenance stores, running through the conduit ducts between the hub and 5 key defensive positions. No electronics, just wire and voice. Talk to each other, she told her 11, like it's the old days. It was the thing that saved them in the first hour. Dara found the child during the retreat from Shaft 4. She was 7 years old, maybe 8, sitting in the gap between 2 cooling units in the eastern junction, wrapped in a thermal blanket, not crying, not shaking. Just watching the junction entrance with the flat, evaluating calm of someone who has already decided that panic doesn't help and moved on. Her name was Sela. Her parents had worked the night shift in the reclamation facility. Dara didn't know them, but she knew the reclamation facility had been the second thing to fall. She looked at Sela for a moment. Sela looked back. "Can you run?" Dara asked. "Yes." "How far?" Sela considered this seriously. "As far as you need." Dara held out her hand. Sela took it. They ran. Later in the hub, with 240 people pressed into a space designed for 80, with the sounds of the Veth audible now through the walls, that low thrumming resonance that set your teeth on edge and made your thoughts slide sideways, Dara would think about what Sela had said. As far as you need, not as far as I can. The distinction mattered. It was the first moment Dara felt in the pit of her stomach that they might actually survive this. The message came through at 0900. Calix had rigged a short-range transmitter from stripped components, enough to punch a signal to the orbital relay, not enough to guarantee it got through. But it got through. And at 0900, a response came back, and it was not what any of them had hoped for. Harkin Extraction's Regional Operations Director, a man named Severin Holt whom Dara had met once at a mandatory safety briefing, and remembered as the kind of person who treated people like line items, had a message for the Kareth 9 colony. The message, relayed in the flat tones of the automated system because Holt had not bothered to record it himself, stated that Harkin Extraction was in ongoing diplomatic negotiations with a Veth representative body regarding the mineral rights of the Kareth 9 system. The colony's situation was known. Assistance was being evaluated. Personnel were advised to shelter in place and avoid escalating actions that might compromise the negotiating position. Personnel were advised to avoid escalating actions. Morrow listened to the playback once. She took a breath. She looked at Dara. "They're going to let the Veth finish it," Dara said, "and renegotiate the mineral rights from a position of neutrality," Morrow said. 600 people, balanced against a planetary system's worth of contracts. Her voice was quiet, precise, the voice of someone who is very carefully not letting herself feel what she is feeling. "They've already done the math." Dara was quiet for a moment. "Then we do it ourselves," she said. Morrow looked at her. "We've been here for 10 years, Dara said. "We know every tunnel, every bore, every maintenance shaft, every air circulation duct in this rock. They know the surface plan. They don't know what we've built underneath. And they came in expecting to push us out, not fight us." She paused. "What do the Veth do when the thing they're pushing back pushes forward instead?" Morrow was quiet for a long moment. "Nobody's ever tried it," she said. "Then they haven't planned for it." The plan was not sophisticated. There was no time for sophistication. What Dara knew, what she had learned in a decade of working rock, was that the deep tunnel network under Kareth 9 colony was a labyrinth that Harkin's official survey maps showed only approximately. The actual bore patterns were messier, more organic, shaped by years of individual crew decisions about the easiest line through difficult stone. She knew tunnels that weren't on any map. She knew vertical shafts that connected levels the Veth wouldn't know were connected. She knew the resonance characteristics of the rock well enough to know which tunnels would amplify sound and which would absorb it. She also knew that the colony's main power feed ran through a central junction in the deepest level of the installation, a junction the Veth, in their sweep of the upper facility, had not yet reached. The plan required 7 people willing to go into the deep levels while the Veth were still in the upper complex, to go toward them rather than away, to use the tunnels to get under them, past them, around them. She asked for volunteers and got 22. She took 6, chosen for tunnel experience and composure under pressure. Sella she left with Morrow, which Sella accepted without argument in the same calm way she seemed to accept everything. Dara spent 10 minutes talking to her before she left. "If we're not back in 3 hours, Dara said, "you follow Morrow. Whatever Morrow says, you do." "Will you be back?" Sella asked. "Yes." Sella looked at her, not the way a child looks when they want to believe something, the way a child looks when they are deciding whether what they've heard is consistent with available evidence. "Okay," she said, 3 hours. The deep levels were cold and dark, and full of the sounds of the Veth moving above them. That thrumming resonance came through the rock differently down here, not through the air but through the stone itself, transmitted by the Veth's footfalls, a constant sub-frequency vibration that pressed against the inside of Dara's skull. She breathed through it. She focused on the tunnel in front of her, on the shape of the rock, on the map she carried in her head accumulated from 10 years of walking these passages. Her team moved without lights in the sections nearest to known Veth positions. She had worked in the dark before, sensor failures, equipment outages, the kind of ordinary underground emergencies that never made it into Harkin's incident reports. The dark was not her enemy. She had learned to navigate by hand feel and spatial memory, and the particular quality of airflow from different directions. Petrov, 40 years old, built like the rock he'd been cutting for 2 decades, the quietest man Dara had ever worked with, moved directly behind her, one hand on her shoulder. The others followed in a chain. Nobody spoke. They had agreed on a hand signal language before they descended, simple enough to communicate in the dark by touch. 3 of the Veth were stationed in the mid-level connecting corridor between Shaft 7 and the power junction. Dara knew they were there before she saw them because she felt the resonance change, a slight shift in frequency, the way you feel a person's presence before you hear their footstep. She stopped the chain with a double tap to Petrov's hand. They held still. The Veth were 10 meters ahead. She could feel them, the way she could feel the vibration of a drill head at the far end of a bore. She thought about the tunnel geometry, about the ventilation shaft 6 meters back on the left, about the fact that the Veth sensory organs processed electromagnetic fields, not body heat, not sound in the human range, about the copper wire in Morrow's hardline, and what it would look like to something that hunted by electromagnetic sense. She turned the chain around. They retreated 6 meters. She stopped them at the ventilation shaft and made the hand signal for split, Dara and 2 others through the shaft to come out the other side of the Veth position. Petrov and the remaining 3 to wait, and at her signal to make noise. Not just noise, electromagnetic noise. She pressed her comms unit into Petrov's hands, dead, useless as a communication device, but full of electronic components that, if physically activated and shorted, would create a substantial electromagnetic blip. Like a flare, but for creatures that hunted by M field. Petrov understood immediately. He held up 3 fingers. She nodded. She climbed into the ventilation shaft. The shaft was not built for human transit. It was 40 centimeters in diameter, designed for air, and Dara moved through it on her stomach with her arms forward, the rock pressing against her from all sides, the sound of her own breathing enormous in her ears. She moved by increments, pushing with her toes, pulling with her fingertips, feeling the shaft angle slightly downward and then right. 14 meters of this. She counted them by arm lengths. On the other side, she lowered herself into the side passage without a sound, landed in a crouch, held absolutely still. The 2 people behind her, Jenna, and a young driller named Corso, landed beside her in the dark. The Veth were 4 meters to her right. She could feel them perfectly now. The resonance of 3 separate organisms, each slightly different in frequency, the way voices have different timbre. 2 were stationary. 1 was moving slowly, a patrol pattern. She waited. The M flare hit. The reaction of the 3 Veth was immediate and total. All 3 turned simultaneously toward the source, their M-organ arrays focusing on the signal, the moving one accelerating toward it with the swift, purposeful efficiency of a predator that has spent tens of thousands of years chasing prey through tunnels. Dara moved. She moved not toward them but past them, low and fast along the right wall, Jenna and Corso behind her, using the 4 seconds of their distraction to cover the distance to the junction corridor. She didn't think about them. She thought about the path. She thought about the next 6 meters and then the next 6 after that. They reached the power junction in 40 seconds. The junction was the heart of everything. It was a room, one of the few actual rooms in the deep level, built large because the equipment required it. Banks of conduit runs 4 meters high, the main distribution nodes for every powered system in the colony, the thermal transfer units for the geothermal tap that provided 40% of their baseline power. It was also where the Veth had not yet been. The floor was undisturbed, the dust was still. Dara stood in the center of it and let herself breathe for 5 seconds, just 5. Then she started working. She had built and repaired power systems for a decade. She understood the junction the way she understood her own apartment, the location of every component, the path of every circuit, the tolerance limits of every conduit. What she was designing in her head as she moved was not a weapon in any conventional sense. It was an inversion. A way of taking the colony's existing power infrastructure and turning it into something the Veth's M-sensitive biology would find incompatible with continued function. Corso watched her hands and said quietly, "What are you building?" "A bad day for anything with electromagnetic sensitive organs," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "How bad?" "Bad enough." The principle was straightforward. The geothermal tap generated more power than the colony consumed. It always had. The surplus normally bled off into heat dissipation nodes. What Dara was doing was rerouting that surplus, not to dissipation, but to the building's primary electromagnetic shielding grid, a grid designed to protect sensitive equipment from external M interference. Run it in reverse, and instead of blocking M radiation, it would generate it. At every frequency in the spectrum, simultaneously, inside the building. It would destroy every piece of unshielded electronics in the colony. It would also hit anything with M-sensitive biology like a wave of static that she genuinely could not predict the effect of, except that the Veth's orientation systems would be completely overwhelmed. They would be blind in the most fundamental sense of the word blind for them, unable to perceive their environment, unable to navigate, unable to communicate. For a period she estimated at between 4 and 8 minutes. 4 minutes was not a lot of time. 4 minutes, inside a building they knew better than the Veth did, against organisms that would be effectively sensory deprived. Dara thought it might be enough. "Corso," she said, "get back to Petrov. Tell him they need to be in a shielded compartment in 4 minutes. Tell Morrow the same. Anyone with a pacemaker or neural implant needs to be shielded. Go." He went. She kept working. Jenna held the junction entrance for the 12 minutes it took Dara to finish the rerouting. She held it with a mining drill running as a cutting tool, and a calm that Dara found, later, almost harder to comprehend than the Veth themselves. 2 Veth came to the junction entrance during those 12 minutes. One of them had a drill burn across its carapace when Jenna came back inside. "Ready," Dara said. Jenna looked at the configuration of conduits Dara had assembled and said, "That's going to be loud." "Yes." "And everything electronic in the building." "Yes." "Including our systems." "Yes." "Okay," Jenna took a breath. "How long do we have to get to a shielded compartment?" "About 40 seconds after I trigger it." "That's not 40 seconds. It's 38, I rounded up." Jenna looked at her for one long moment. Then, "I'll clear the route, move." They ran. The deep tunnels, the ones Dara knew by touch and spatial memory, the ones that weren't on any map, these were the route. Not back the way they came. Down, then around, through the maintenance bore that connected level 4 to the shielded equipment storage on level 3, a space built with electromagnetic shielding, because the calibration instruments stored there were too sensitive to tolerate any interference. Dara triggered the junction remotely at the 30-second mark. The effect, transmitted through the stone itself, was a physical shockwave, not explosion but vibration, a sudden massive distortion of the electromagnetic field that she felt in her fillings, in the metal of her tools, in the slight disorientation of her inner ear. The tunnel lights, which had been running on emergency battery, went out entirely. She ran in the dark, one hand on the left wall counting steps. 18, turn right. 6, drop down. 12. The hatch. She heard Jenna hit the hatch in the dark, heard the manual latch cycle, no electronics, just a lever heard it open. They went in, they pulled it shut. Silence. Then through the stone, the sound of the Veth. It was different from the resonance they used to navigate and communicate. It was a rhythmic, disorganized, the sound of 43 organisms that had spent their entire evolutionary history relying on a sense that had just gone white with static, trying to navigate an unfamiliar tunnel complex in total sensory blackout. Dara sat on the floor of the shielded compartment in the dark and listened to it and thought, there it is. That's the thing they didn't plan for. Morrow's people moved in the 4 minutes and 30 seconds that the M field held. They had the map. They had the tunnels. They had the hardline, which Morrow had kept intact and which was the only communication system still functioning in the colony. They moved in coordinated groups through every passage the Veth had come in through, and they moved fast, and they moved with the absolute precision of people who have had 10 years to learn the geography of the place they are defending. It was not a slaughter. Dara would be clear about this later in every account she gave. The Veth were not helpless. Even disoriented, even blind by their own perceptual standards, they were physically formidable, and 6 of the colony's people were badly injured in the clearance. Ren lost 3 fingers to a reflexive carapace strike from a Veth soldier that couldn't see him, but could feel the air displacement of his movement. A woman named Patrol took an M-pulse discharge from a Veth whose sensory organs were recovering faster than anticipated, and her left arm was nerve dead for 6 weeks before treatment could be arranged. But the Veth were out of the colony by the time the M field faded, all 43 of them. Some through the tunnels they had entered through, some through alternate exits, some through the emergency surface hatches on the eastern perimeter. When the M field faded, the Veth were outside in the open, in the thin atmosphere of Karath 9's surface. And the colony's people were inside, in the tunnels and corridors they knew, behind doors they were already sealing. The Veth fleet began orbital bombardment at 1400 hours. This was not unexpected. Morrow had assumed it would happen once the surface units were repelled, a correction from above, the kind of systematic response a civilization that thought in terms of sterilization would make. She had spent the time between the clearance and 1400 doing 2 things, getting everyone as deep as possible and getting a transmission out. Not to Harkin extraction, to the conquered xenological emergency channel, a frequency maintained by the interstellar conquered for exactly this kind of situation, one that Harkin extraction did not know Morrow had the codes for, and one that Harkin extraction would have very much preferred she not use, because activating it made the situation officially a matter of interstellar law rather than a private corporate negotiation. The transmission was 12 words long. Karath 9 colony, 600 civilians, Veth assault, requesting conquered emergency jurisdiction. Morrow sent it 4 times in case one didn't get through. Then she went down to the deep levels to find Dara and Sela. The bombardment lasted 9 hours. Karath 9 rock was old and dense. The processing facility's infrastructure, built to withstand the stresses of deep mining, absorbed the orbital kinetic strikes better than the Veth's targeting models had apparently anticipated. The surface was devastated, every structure above ground flattened within the first 2 hours, every landing pad, every surface vehicle, every antenna array. The great drilling rigs that had stood for 10 years, visible from orbit, came down one by one. Below the surface, in the deep rock, 601 people waited. Sela had found Dara in the shielded compartment and was sitting beside her when the first strike hit, close enough that even 400 meters of rock above them vibrated with it. The concussion came through the floor, through their bones. Dust filtered from the ceiling. Sela did not flinch. Dara looked at her. "It's louder than I thought," Sela said, in the tone of someone revising an estimate. "Yeah." A second strike. Closer. The lights flickered, battery backup, stripped down to essentials, still running because Morrow's people had shielded the battery room along with everything else critical. "Are they going to get through?" Sela asked. Dara thought about 400 meters of dense basaltic rock, about the survey data she had memorized, about the depth ratings of the infrastructure. "Not before help comes," she said. "When is help coming?" "I don't know exactly." Sela accepted this. She was quiet for a while. Around them, in the packed compartment, other people were quiet too. That particular quality of silence that is not absence of noise, but presence of collective held breath. My dad used to say that rock remembers, Sela said finally. What does that mean? He said the planet holds everything that ever happened in it, pressure and time. That's why the crystal seams form, the rock remembers stress, and crystals are how it stores it. She paused. He worked in the crystal survey section. The reclamation facility, night shift. Dara didn't say anything. She put her arm around Sela's shoulders. Another strike. The farthest yet, the Veth targeting was walking backward across the surface, systematically obliterating every structure, moving away from them. They think we're already gone, Dara said quietly. We're not gone, Sela said. No. The rock remembers, Sela said. We stayed, that counts. The conquered vessel, unwavering precedent, arrived in the Kareth 9 system at 0300 on the second day. It was a diplomatic vessel, not a warship, carrying 3 conquered arbiters, a staff of 12, and a standing emergency protocol that, once invoked, suspended all hostile action within the system pending a formal hearing. The protocol was backed by 43 member civilizations, including the Veth Concordance. It was not something the Veth fleet commander could legally ignore. The bombardment stopped at 0317. The silence that followed was so complete that people in the deep levels woke from sleep, because the absence of vibration felt wrong after 18 hours of it. Dara heard it first. She was awake, she had not slept, had been sitting in the corridor outside the main shelter compartment, running calculations in her head that didn't need running, because that was what her hands needed to do when her brain would not quiet. She heard the last strike, felt the vibration, and then felt nothing. She sat with it for several seconds, making sure. Then she walked back into the compartment and found Maro, who was also awake, sitting with the hardline receiver in her lap. Did you feel that? Dara asked. Yes. How long? Long enough. Maro's voice was careful, the way voices are when they are trying not to assume. I need 2 more minutes to be sure. They waited 2 minutes. Nothing. Maro set down the receiver. She let out a long, slow breath. She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she opened them and stood up. Wake everyone, she said. Carefully, don't run, don't crowd the exits, bring the children first. They came up through the maintenance shafts in the pre-dawn dark of Kareth 9 surface. The surface was wrong in the way that changed places are wrong, the same geography, the same horizon, the same quality of light, but everything that had stood above it gone. The processing facility, rubble. The dormitory blocks, flattened. The drilling rigs, which Dara had watched go up 10 years ago, and which had seemed permanent enough to stand for a century, stripped to their base anchors, the rest of them scattered across the regolith in pieces that caught the light. 601 people stood on the surface of the place they had lived, and looked at what had been done to it. Sela stood beside Dara. She didn't say anything for a long time. The unwavering precedent was visible now, high overhead, a point of moving light against the stars, descending on approach burn. The sky was clear. Kareth 9 Primary, a yellow dwarf, smaller than Earth's sun, was coming up over the eastern ridge, and its light was the color of old copper on the broken stone. It looks different, Sela said finally. Yes. My dad used to say you never look at a place the same way twice. She was quiet for a moment. I think that's more true now. Dara looked at her. Sela's face was lit by the rising sun, the same calm expression she'd had since the first moment Dara had found her in the junction, the one that had nothing to do with not feeling things and everything to do with having decided how to carry them. What do you do now? Dara asked. It was not a question about the next hour. Sela understood that. I stay, she said. This is the place that held us. You don't leave a place like that. The Concord hearing lasted 14 months. Dara testified 3 times, once to the arbiters, once to the Veth Concordance's own inquiry board, once to the joint session that produced the final ruling. She was not a lawyer and not a diplomat and had no experience with interstellar law, and she was careful to say so every time she took the stand. What she did have was a decade of survey data, a detailed understanding of the tunnel network, and the kind of clear-eyed recall that comes from having paid attention during events that most people preferred not to think about afterward. Harkin Extractions, Severin Holt testified as well. He said, with the precision of someone who had been very carefully advised, that the corporation had been engaged in good faith negotiations and had fully intended to render assistance when the situation clarified. He said this with a straight face. Dara watched him say it and thought about the message that had arrived at 0900, the one that had told 600 people in an active combat situation to avoid escalating actions. The arbiters, who had read the communication logs, said nothing when Holt testified. They merely noted everything with the methodical patience of people who understand that the record speaks for itself. The ruling, when it came, found that the Veth assault on Kareth 9 colony constituted an unauthorized use of force against a recognized civilian settlement under Concord Charter. The Veth Concordance, while not sanctioned, the Crystal Formation argument was recognized as a legitimate cultural grievance, was required to fund the full reconstruction of the colony, and to establish a joint oversight committee for the Kareth 9 mineral operations going forward. Harkin Extraction was found to have violated its duty of care to employees under Concord Labor Protocol. The corporation was dissolved. Its assets in the Kareth 9 system were transferred to a worker cooperative, which meant, in practical terms, to the 601 people who had stayed in the rock. Dara was not present for the announcement. She was 400 meters underground in Shaft 7, checking the seismic monitors. The morning was quiet. The rock was still. The readout showed nothing but the ordinary baseline vibration of a planet going about its business, the slow drift of tectonic plates, the deep percussion of geological time, the particular frequency signature of a moon that had been here for 4 billion years and would be here for 4 billion more. She picked up her coffee, she listened. Morrow's voice came through the new comm system, hardened, shielded, built to spec this time rather than patched together in a hurry. Survey team ready at Shaft 9. You coming? Give me 10 minutes. You're always checking those monitors. Somebody has to. A pause. Then in a different tone, yeah, somebody does. Dara finished her coffee. She looked at the readout one more time. 43 signatures, organized movement, bearing north. The moment that had started all of it, the morning she had noticed what nobody else was looking for. She turned off the monitor, picked up her gear, and went to find the others. Sella was 17 when she finished her survey training. She was 21 when she published the first complete subterranean acoustic map of Kareth 9, a document that took 3 years to compile and became, in the field of xenogeological survey, something close to foundational. She had, as it turned out, inherited her father's instinct for listening to rock. She named the deep crystal formation she discovered at level 9, the one with the molecular structure that the Veth called ancestral memory, the Vosren Formation, after the foreman who had listened to the first alert and the surveyor who had noticed something wrong in the early morning dark. The Veth sent a delegation to see it. They came in the proper way this time, through the surface hatch, with a Concord observer, on an official survey visit. 3 of them, moving through the deep corridors with the fluid efficiency Dara remembered, but without the resonance of aggression, without the thrumming that had pressed against her skull all those years ago. The resonance they used now was different, more like the vibration of something listening. Sella guided them personally. She spoke no Veth and they spoke no human standard, but they had a translator unit, and more importantly they had, between them, a shared language of geological curiosity that turned out to need very little translation. At level 9, in the chamber where the crystal formation spread across 40 meters of wall and structures that caught the work lights and scattered them into something that looked, genuinely, like frozen time, the Veth stopped. The lead delegate placed one foreleg flat against the crystal surface. The resonance changed. Dara, standing at the chamber entrance watching, felt it in her chest, not the combat frequency, not the disorienting static of distress, but something lower and steadier. Something that felt impossibly like recognition. Sela stood beside the Veth delegate and looked at the crystal wall, and Dara looked at Sela and thought, there it is. That's the thing they didn't plan for either. That staying has its own kind of depth, that the rock remembers theirs and ours both. The work lights caught the formation. The Veth resonated. Sela took notes in a small, worn notebook she had carried since she was 8 years old. The same notebook, the same handwriting, changed only in the way that things change when they have been used rather than abandoned. The colony hummed around them, new systems, new structures, built on the same footprint, anchored to the same deep rock. 400 meters above, the surface was alive again. The drilling rigs were back. The survey flags fluttered in Kareth 9 thin wind. 603 people, still here. Still listening to the rock.